Sound design is perhaps one of the most important ingredients to a successful movie or video game, but it is often overlooked. And that's because good sound design for your average person should go unnoticed. What I mean is, the sound shouldn't detract from the viewer's experience, it should rather immerse them into the story or gameplay. Sounds easy, right? Wrong. Good sound design takes an incredible amount of effort and attention to detail, and in my experience, can feel a lot like creating a painting or putting together a complex recipe. Imagine for a moment you're a great artist and you want to create a painting that conveys the overwhelming experience of terror. Well, then you might start by choosing your colors, most likely dark ones, blacks, blues, and grays. But maybe that doesn't quite capture the way you feel terror in your soul. So you reach for something bold, red, and you splash some on the canvas and think, I like that, but it could use a little more. So you throw some more on there, only to realize now that it's a bit too much, so you reel it back, make a couple of tweaks, and call it done. It's those moments of realization that you've gone too far or haven't gone far enough that separates a good artist from a great one. And sound design is no different. Let me show you. Let's create a sound for the fiery part of this spell. When starting a new project, the most important step is picking your sounds to work with. Much like a painter has a good idea of the colors they will be working with before they start painting, a good sound designer will have many pre-recorded sounds in mind, and if they don't have them on hand, they'll have a pretty good idea of what they can record to achieve what they are after. This may sound loose and broad, and that's because it is. This part of sound design is something that is learned and honed over years of experience, and mostly done so through active listening. Active listening is where you listen to the world around you but actively think about the sounds objects are making. Where someone might hear pots in the kitchen clanging, a sound designer might hear a bell. This is where a lot of individuality and creativity can come into play. It's also important to actively listen when watching your favorite movies or video games and think about how they got the sounds that they use. Active listening is a crucial skill that all sound designers are continually honing throughout their careers, and in my opinion is one of the most enjoyable things about sound design. Taking a random sound that you heard in the world and shaping it into exactly what you hear in your mind, it's really quite exhilarating and can oftentimes feel like real life magic.
Wingardium Leviosa.
But back to our project. So what would work with this fire spell? Well, for obvious reasons, a good place to start would be with fiery recordings. So for this project, I will be using the free flammable liquid library from Boom Library. This library has 18 different recordings, all of which came from a flamethrower. Now that we have our sound selected, we need to find a place to start. The beauty of working on a digital canvas is that we can start wherever we want, but for simplicity's sake, I'll start with the lead up before the impact. Now, this library has only 18 different recordings, but they are all labeled, which makes it easier to choose which ones to use. And if you're starting to create your own library, I suggest doing the same thing with your sounds, because labeling your sounds and organizing them will make working on future projects much easier and much faster. I'll start with this single long whoosh. I don't need the entire recording, so I'll trim it down and apply some fades. That sounds pretty good, but I'd like to add a whistling sound, like when a plane drops a bomb. Luckily, I already recorded a bottle rocket that sounds like this, so all I have to do is reverse the audio so it sounds like the whistling is coming towards us and pitch shift it up about half an octave. And that's it. Real quick, if you're following along in this project, don't feel like you need a bottle rocket to make this sound. Feel free to record yourself whistling or find other objects around your house that you could create a whistle sound with, like blowing into a straw. Okay, back to the project. I like that for now, so let's move on to the juicy bits. The impact. Getting a good impact sound can be incredibly difficult sometimes, which is why it's so important to have good source material. Thankfully, this library has a single, thick, short burst that I think will work perfectly. Like the lead up, I don't need the entire recording, so I'm going to trim off the front part of it just enough so that the sound starts at its loudest point. I also don't need all of the bits at the end either, so I'm going to get rid of that as well. This might sound a bit weird at first, but I promise it will all come together. I like what we have so far, but the impact is missing some high-end information, and what I mean by that is it needs some high-end frequencies to help it cut through and be right in your face. So all I'm going to do is duplicate the track, trim down the clip a little bit more, and use an equalizer to remove most of the low-end information and boost the high-end stuff. Once all of the low-end is removed, I'll use this free transient shaper plugin from Kilohearts to give it more of a bite. Now that sounds much better. I'm sure you think that it sounds awful, but we need one last ingredient, and that is the tail. Loud noises like explosions and gunshots typically have tails that in a lot of cases help represent the size of the world or area that the noise is taking place in. In our case, however, it's to help round out the sound of the dissipating flames while also providing a sense of size. For this, we can use the single medium burst in its entirety. The only thing I did here was automate some of the equalization in the mid-range to give it some movement. Otherwise, the recording sounds perfect as is. Here's the impact in its entirety. And here's the entire sound with the pre-impact. Now, we could just stop here, but like we talked about earlier in Moments of Realization, I've noticed areas that could use a little more improvement. The pre-impact, I feel, is missing a little more oomph to help build anticipation before the impact. So I'll take the same sound we used for the impact, reverse it, and then trim it. I also added a little bit of white noise and EQ'd it to give it some breath. Here's a before and after. Much better in my opinion. Lastly, if you look at the explosion, you'll see bits of electricity surrounding the impact, and I wanted to capture this. The problem is, electrical sounds can be some of the more difficult ones to find natural instances of to record, and are typically created by manipulating a sound via plugins or by creating something from scratch on a synthesizer. So I sifted through my library, found a recording of a sparkler, played around with it for a bit, and ended up with this. This method of taking a sound and molding it into something else entirely takes a bit of trial and error and a lot of patience, but it is some of the most fun you'll ever have sound designing, so try not to take it too seriously and just enjoy the process. Finally, here's the finished sound. Of course, since we're working with a spell in this case, you can really go wild with the sound effects. Like here, I used a Viking war horn that I turned into a weird descending sound for the pre-impact. It's absolutely not necessary and isn't a sound that you would think to put in just by looking at it, but I believe it adds something a little fantastical, which is perfect for sounds created for a world of fantasy. Sound design is like any other art. There's a lot of room for self-expression, there's tons of room for experimentation, and of course, don't forget to have fun. I'll see you in the next one.